listening to No Brow.
When I'm using the term class anxiety, one of the things I'm really interested in is how precarity and uncertainty is actually moving up the class system. So I think, increasingly people with middle-class good educations are finding that when they come out of university, they can't get a full-time job and they're on doing internships and short-term casual contracts and stuff like that. And I think much of the writing around hipsters and bogans is actually a reflection of the anxieties that these social changes have produced. So the hipster, I think, has become this kind of ironic kind of consumer clown that middle-class people can kind of laugh at and kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink, yeah, I'm kind of like that, but it's not so bad. Whereas the bogan is kind of a folk devil. And there's almost, I think, a real resentment of people, particularly, coal miners, for instance, that, earning 150, maybe even 300 grand a year. And there's this kind of middle-class resentment. I've got a PhD, but I don't earn that much. This is unfair. So this is the kind of politics and the symbolic politics around those kind of categories that I'm interested in. So, am I a hipster or bogan? I've had my own anecdotal experience with these figures. I like playing and watching sports. I'm very partial to a sausage roll and a meat pie, and I drink a lot of beer. I wear thongs at every opportunity and pretty much been wearing the same thing since the 1990s. Apparently this is bogan stuff. On the other hand, I like bands of which you've probably never heard. I buy LPs and tapes, and I go to gigs in places that are not really venues. I've also become something of a coffee snob. Apparently, this is hipster stuff. This was summed up well one week when I was having a beer after a gig with a friend in the inner west suburb of Sydney in Newtown. He asked was I going to drive back down from Newcastle on the weekend to go to another gig. When I replied that I couldn't because it was the start of the cricket season next Saturday, he said, cricket's for bogans. That weekend at cricket, I was asked by a teammate what I did last weekend. I said I went to see the RIP Society gig in Newtown last weekend. He replied, what the hell is that? You're a bloody hipster, Thready. It is exchanges like these, along with the growing use of figures like hipster and bogan in the media, that's led me to asking these questions, like, just how floating are these floating signifiers? What do they mean and what purpose do they serve? Is this the way that class is produced and policed in a so-called classist society? I don't think symbols can ever be meaningless. And the key criticism of kind of hipster culture in that sense is they tend to take various symbols and reappropriate them in various ways that are actually can be particularly quite racist. So there's a particular trope that you see in a lot of stories about hipsters is the use of Native American headdress at festivals and the kind of wearing these as a fashion item, which, for many people is profoundly offensive. Yet the response to that is like, hang on, and we're just having fun with these things, right? It's no big deal. While that may be ironic in and of itself as well, it's very problematic politically in terms of the symbolic politics of this, I think. There's a cop-out going on somewhere that I think is quite problematic. On the other way, though, I'm interested in the term bogan. The commentary around that tends to be directed at other people. It's not really a conversation. It tends to be more about kind of disgust and denigration of what other people do. So in opinion pieces in particular, hipster tends to provoke debates about those things of sexism and racism or whatever. The pieces about bogan tend to be just, that person's a bogan and that's sexist and they're racist. There's no real discussion. So from my sociological point of view, what's interesting is there tends to be homology between people that write in the media and hipsters in terms of their cultural practices and tastes. But there's a cultural distance between, middle-class journos and opinion makers and who are being called bogan at whatever time in society.
And that's the contemporary class anxiety, whereas it could be acceptable to be called a hipster. You can deal with that. There is a distance of the bogan. The bogan is someone that you don't deal with, that you don't come into direct contact with, and lives in something of a netherworld, nether region, right on the fringe suburbs.
Yeah, definitely. There's definitely a geographical thing going on in cities in particular. So hipsters are in a city, bogans are suburbs and the outer suburbs. I suppose one of the points I want to make is I don't think these things actually exist. I'm not saying that there aren't people with silly mustaches, and there's not kind of boofy blokes that want to get into a fight too much, right? But I think these terminologies, when they're attached to particular classes, become stereotypes that actually promote a certain kind of politics that's, again, very problematic. And it takes away the kind of economic problems that much, I suppose, analysis of inequality these days are absent from, or is absent.
Subcultures are something that a lot of people find and substantiate their identity through, especially youth. To be called a punk and to associate yourself with that gives you a lot of self-confidence, and there's a lot of other merits and values that have been established to come with that. Is the same to be said possibly of hipster culture, or is it going to live as a pejorative term?
I think that's an interesting question, and I'm not 100% sure of the answer yet, but and I'm actually doing some interviews about this kind of stuff now, but in terms of my analysis of the media, which I've been doing for the past 2 years, and I've built up pages and pages of links to various web articles and the like. I'm not really finding any examples of people saying that I'm a hipster, like they would say I'm a punk or a goth or whatever. So it tends to be a terminology that people use about others to criticise their cultural practice. So I don't think it can be used as a subculture in the traditional cultural studies sense. It's something different to that, and I suppose that's why I find it so interesting, because references to hipster and bogan in the popular media are legion. Like, they're in the newspaper and magazines and popular websites every day. So that's what I'm kind of finding interesting, is that these things are kind of created by people to talk about others. They're not created by people to talk about themselves.
With bogan culture, just really recently in the last couple of years, there's been, say, the television shows, competitions to find Australia's biggest bogan, and now suddenly people want to join in that race, and these are people who you could say genuinely are bogans, whatever that term is, because they fit the fashion, they fit the identity, and they fit the belief structure. Is this a cultural shift, or is this just a piece of entertainment that's run off the tracks?
Oh, I think it's entertainment. I don't think the people that are participating in that show are actually, in any real sense, claiming to be a bogan. I think they're kind of caught up in, whatever the reality television is, being on it and all that 15 minutes of fame kind of stuff. But there is examples, I think, in popular culture where there's a playfulness around bogan now that maybe wasn't around a few years ago. And the show Bogan Pride and Middle Class Bogan and stuff like that kind of play with these tropes as well, that I think in some ways highlight the hypocrisies of the terminology. So I'm still in the early stages of looking at it, but I'm finding that interesting too, and that's a really recent phenomenon in a term that's existed for so long. It's only very recently that there's kind of been popular appearances of kind of ironic takes on it, whereas the hipster, for instance, almost started as an ironic terminology.
Okay, alright, it's about time I tear some bloody walls down, alright? Not all bogans are feral as f***. It's about time you realise some of us are into the finer things, like wine. That's right, no VB or West End for me, thank you very much. I'll stick to my 1985 Shiraz. It's full-bodied, it's got a beautiful berry aroma, it's mellowed with maturation with just a hint of smokiness from the French oak.
I think if we're going to think about it as marketing categories, again, the terms aren't used in the ads, but the symbolism and the iconography is. Again, VB aren't saying I'm directing these ads at bogans. You wouldn't do that, right? But they use kind of the iconography of what we may connect with that terminology to do that.
I mean, my question, I guess, is even though they're not using the term bogan, how can you identify that these are the symbols of a bogan culture, say in a VB ad, and still be selling that drink, whereas surely this is something that no one wants to be pegged with?
That's right. So, again, the lack of actually calling it that in the ads, and people don't call them that themselves. But so I suppose to explain that is that, people have different tastes. And from a stereotypical point of view, we might associate something like VB with bogan, and something like, a boutique beer where there's only like 10 of them in the world made in another country with hipster. So marketers tend to grab hold of those stereotypes and use them to, direct their advertising at particular groups of people. But I don't think they're actually directing them at what we would call hipster and bogan. They're just kind of using those symbols, I suppose, to appeal to a specific group of people. What's interesting about that is how those different symbols are actually blurry. In some of my studies, I'm looking at the genre of Dolewave, for instance, where these are kind of alternate kind of rock bands that do things like create LPs and make tapes that in some analysis would be seen as kind of hipster activity, but much of the iconography around Dolewave is singlets and drinking VB, and it's kind of almost a political, I suppose, symbolic thing going on there. So the class boundaries in that sense are blurry. You can't necessarily say that something is a particular class, because from a different perspective it will be the opposite.
Living on a fortnightly basis, Monday's my day. Peak in my week, I got off to a slow start. Round the bay in a day, it keeps the wolves at bay. And I'm not gonna let you hang around in my way, 'cause I'm on to start again. I'm on to start again. 'Cause something wasn't working, so I'm on to start again. Suzanne's fun run, I'm done. I'm done. My hammies, my knees, my asses, my mind all gone. And I'm done. And my kids all hate me, but that ain't gonna break me. 'Cause I'm on to start again. I'm on to start again. Something wasn't working, so I'm on to start again. Wasn't reading the signs, and it hit me from behind. 'Cause I'm on to start again. I'm on to start again. Something wasn't working, so I'm on to start again. My friend.
Welcome back to the Nobel Art Show with Andrew on 4ZZZ in Brisbane and around Australia, thanks to the Community Radio Network. Just before that, that was Dick Diver with New Start Again, and it led off part of a conversation with Dr. Stephen Threadgold from the University of Newcastle, talking about music, class, and identity in the time of Dolewave, a term that's been tagged to such groups as Dick Diver for some blog-worthy posts in recent times. Now we're going to return to our chat with Steve now on Dolewave, Hipsters, Bogans, and Australian contemporary class anxieties.
One of the sociologists that I'm most influenced by, Pierre Bourdieu, has this very famous quote, and it's called "Taste classifies, and it classifies the classifier." So if you're likely to say something is bogan, that category that you just made up also categorises you, because someone else might put it in a different category, and that categorisation would categorise them. So it's a kind of somewhat playfulness and irony around those categories too that I'm also finding really...
You've been researching, and you're obviously a fan of a lot of music, and you've been working out during your research and your writing where your current tastes are kind of fitting, and you just touched on Dolewave there. I was wondering if you could kind of reflect on I guess where these terms are kind of being implanted into underground music making, even though there's tapes and records that are being pressed, there's still huge amounts of money that are involved in these. It's not easy enterprise whatsoever, but there seems to be a lack of admission of that. I was wondering if you find that.
I think that's always the case in artistic cultures, that no one really wants to talk about the money. People want to talk about the art, right? But people have to live. Again, I would say that in terms of that, a lot of the bands that have been put in what I would call the non-genre of Dolewave, of course, again, it seems to be a terminology that most people don't really want to have connected to them. Are what Ian Rogers calls hobbyists. They aren't necessarily making a full-time living out of this stuff, and they're doing it on the side. So, the economy of that is really interesting. The term Dolewave itself, I think, what I'm finding most interesting about it is the discussions around it. So I'm not that interested in what bands are kind of categorised as Dolewave, even though there seems to be a canon that's evolving around it. I'm more interested in some of the blog entries and journalistic pieces that discuss the terminology around particular recent politics, and how, some writers are kind of positioning it as a reaction against or to recent Australian politics that has seen inequality rise, has seen precariousness rise, has seen, even kind of jobs be what's called upwardly credentialised, where you've got to go to uni and study more and more to get jobs that are actually lower and lower on the social status scale. And this makes kind of the traditional good life of, buying a house and, growing up and getting married and all that stuff meant to be, do it by your 30 increasingly impossible. So the writers I've been kind of looking at have been kind of pitching Dolewave as somewhat as an artistic response to that. The terminology, whether people want to grab hold of it or not, I'm not that concerned of, really. I'm just interested in the politics around it.
We're talking about the current political climate. There is still like a reluctance or a lack of direct political engagement in a lot of this music, especially around Dolewave and a lot of the underground genres and circles of music making in Australia that you're engaged with.
Well, it's interesting. I don't necessarily see political music as having to specifically be sloganistic or promoting a certain politics. I don't know, maybe Hourly Daily by UMI 20 years ago was a great Australian political record that was just sketching out the minutiae of everyday life and the problems that people face. I think that Dolewave in some ways is some of the albums that are kind of lumped into that category are really good examples of that. The politics of everyday life, I think, is something that's really important and something that needs to be expressed. So, whether that's punk or not, in terms of the politics of popular music, I'm not as concerned about. I think politics in that sense, we need to think about it in terms of everyday experience and emotions and feelings. And I think by celebrating, the small everyday resistances in an overtly maybe horrible political environment is something that is an inherently political act.
Is there a particular song that you'd like to leave the interview on today?
I don't know. The UV Race, Be Yourself. Is that the name of the song? Yeah, something like that. I think would be a good expression of. I think they're a really interesting band in terms of what I'm talking about. In that sense, in terms of their symbolic nature, in terms of the lyrics of their songs, in terms of the band members, they seem to very easily cut across that hipster bogan dichotomy that I'm somewhat using in really playful and useful ways. And I think they're really interesting in that sense.
Well, we'll leave it on with UV Race, Be Yourself. Thanks, Stephen.